Hi everyone, my name is Alex from Rasa, and I actually have been here now the third time in a row. So I was here 2 years ago, very first conference, which was great up in the Presidio last year as well, and then this is the third time in SF. We also had a great event in New York, so I'm a big fan of this conference, also because it's a bit smaller and actually allows for a lot of conversations in between, so I'm happy that you're all here. And I really want to talk a bit about expectation setting in conversational AI. And the title of the presentation is between super dumb and super intelligent. And you're going to hear more about what I actually mean with that. But maybe just real quick on Rasa and what we do. So we're an open source framework for building conversational AI. We started 2.5 years ago and pretty much have been growing ever since very fast across the developer communities. We actually had a developer conference here in this venue yesterday, and some people still wear the Rasa shirts from yesterday. So if you're interested to learn more about how they use Rasa in the wild, probably good to approach them. Other than looking at my slides, I mean, I can obviously promise you that it's the best tool that you've ever seen, but it's always good to talk to real developer users. And so, as I said, we've been growing fast across different industries, and actually yesterday, and this number is not updated here, but we announced that we have 1.5 million downloads now, so this number is from May, so it gives you some perspective on how fast we are growing. We're really excited about this, and I'm also going to talk more about what we actually work on. But as I said, the topic is a bit more about expectation setting, and I think that's just something that we've seen early on. In this space, pretty much ever since Facebook Messenger opened up their API, everyone was excited and people were like, bots are the new apps, right? You probably still remember that back then Nadella from Microsoft was very vocal about it. And so here we are now, 3 years later, it still hasn't happened yet. And so I think the question is also a bit why didn't it happen? And from our experience also talking to developers, but also executives in big companies, there's always been a lot of expectations for these chatbots, right? It's kind of human level intelligence. Ideally, you upload all your 2 million transcripts that you have from human to human interaction, and then it magically works and just figures out everything, right? So that's kind of the expectation level in the early days, and I think still a lot of people are on those expectations at the moment. And that's really what we kind of defined here as the autonomous organization, right? And so as much as this is a super exciting vision to work towards to, and obviously, for business executives, something really interesting as well, because you can automate a lot of the workforce that you have at the moment, which that's a totally separate side conversation as well, which I'm sure most people here think about as well. It's the ethical side of this. But then, as much as this is exciting to build and work towards, so from a technical standpoint, it's just really hard, right? And so I think most people got also very early on delusionalized with building a chatbot and realizing that it's actually really hard. And that's how we actually started Rasa. So we were in my kitchen in Berlin, my co-founder and I, and back then we used Wit.ai, Dialogflow, back then called API.ai, and a bunch of other tools, and really tried to just build a chatbot, right? And everyone was saying chatbots are the new apps, and we were just are we really stupid here? Because we couldn't really figure it out how to build something more interesting. And so that's, I think, really something where the conversations at the moment more and more mature in a way that people have more expectations that are real for that, right? And so what we try to do with these 5 levels of AI assistance is really to set a bit of the frame for the conversation, right? And maybe it's 5 levels, maybe it's 6 or 7, it actually doesn't matter. We stole these 5 levels from autonomous driving because I think it's just something people can kind of relate to. But I think it's a good framework to start thinking about. So if you think about notifications as one-way conversations, that happened pretty much over the last 10 years, ever since the iPhone was released, that's a very good way to think about just the easiest chatbot that you can build, right? Just send a message. Then I think a lot in the market right now is very much FAQ based. It's one question and one answer. That's what we call level 2. And that's, I think, what most people would also call chatbots. Then what we've been back then in my kitchen and ever since tried to build and tried to let other developers build is what we call a contextual assistant. And I'll talk more about what that actually means. And then there is a whole other level to this, to make it more personalized, right? To have an assistant that actually knows you really well and knows your habits and can make recommendations and all of that. And then the last piece is really an entire company pretty much running on different AI assistants. And we had Lemonade here yesterday presenting what they've been automating around customer support, and I think that's one exciting way to think about it, right? Like customer support is one, sales, marketing, etc. And so ideally they all work together, but this is, I think, a very, very long vision in the future to make this happen, right? And so as much as like IBM Watson will tell you that this already works now, from our experience, from the developer side of things, it doesn't yet. And that's pretty much what we want to build as a company. We want to build like the operating system for those autonomous organizations at some point. And so we are still, I think, as much as like 3 years have passed now, in the early days of conversational AI. And so as I said, it's like very much like one question, one answer, so FAQs. And so one way to think about it here, I need to renew my renter's insurance, how much will it be? And then you just give a response and send it to somebody, right? So in this case, all you need is like a good NLP engine, and then you map that to intents, maybe pull out some entities or so, and that's it. The reality though is that most people don't ask questions like that, and even if they do, there is more context to it that you have to fetch. And that's really what we mean with like level 3, right? And so having this full conversation and getting this full quote for your renter's insurance is, I think, what most users expect, right? So they expect these natural conversations, but then at the same time, where you can really, I think, convince them that this is something cool for them to use is once you do something else in a different system, right? So once you calculate the actual renter's insurance price, once you let them buy it through that, right? Once you do a checkout process, once you save something into another system. And so that's really, or like once you turn the light bulb on or so, right? And so all of that stuff is where people are like, wow, that's magic. And so the most successful AI assistants I think that we've seen out there do something like that, which usually also requires some form of locked-in experience. And so Google, I think, had a good example of that 1.5 years ago, where they had Google Duplex on stage very famously, and it's also obviously launched now, available, and that's super cool, right? Because you can actually get this appointment scheduled, you can have like something in your calendar through this, and so it's interconnecting with all of those systems. And so as much as everyone wants that most companies struggle with building. And so one other good example is Adobe here, and if you can quickly play that, Stefan, please.
Finding the perfect image or video can be like finding a needle in a haystack. At Adobe, we're using machine learning and AI to help you find the perfect content faster. Find photos of flowers with people, more red. Can you add a sombrero? Now let's try to find an outdoors photo of a woman and a dog. Replace beach with forest. More snow. Find similar images. More authentic. Perfect. Edit in Photoshop.
And so I think that's a good example of how it keeps context, right? So you pretty much have a search query at the beginning, and then you add something to it, then you take something out of it again. So that's a very specific use case, but a good example of contextual. In this case, actually, Brett had like not so much like voice input or like the longer like text input, but that's obviously something to add as well. And so the question is really like, why is it so hard to build all of that? And I think what we found back then, when we started working on Rasa, was really that it's not just NLU that you need for those systems, right? So as much as like it's important to understand what somebody says, the other big piece to this, and I think most developers here in the audience would agree, is really that it's all about like what do you say after? So like the dialogue management, if you will, right? And back then what we did, we just had a lot of handcrafted rules. So we would say things like, you know, if somebody asks for this with the search query that Brett just did with the image, right? So if he asks for a woman, and in this context, he then also asks for flowers, then combine this, and in this case, search for flowers and woman, right? And that works for a demo, but it really usually breaks when it's in production, and especially once you have multiple use cases. And so the same way as for NLU, you can't just go and make up all the rules that are in a language, which obviously failed over the last couple of years. And since like deep learning has been around, and obviously with BERT now, people are really, really excited about like more sophisticated natural language understanding. The same is true for dialogue management, because you can't really just come up with all the different rules that you have in your system you have to pretty much learn from conversations, and ideally, and that's really, I think, where a lot of people get excited about when it comes to AI, is that you can generalize to new situations that you haven't seen before, right? So if somebody interrupts the conversation and the system is intelligently able to learn from those interruptions and then in a different context also help handling these interruptions. And that's really what like Rasa and our dialogue management is all about, because we use deep learning for all this dialogue management. And so as much as deep learning is great, right, I think that's also a note here to make, it doesn't solve everything, right? And working with big companies, we also realize that as much as deep learning is something that they appreciate a lot, on the other hand, they also appreciate rules a lot, right? So they appreciate that you have to, as a customer, authenticate yourself through like 5 different things, and you don't want ML to predict that this is really Alex. You really want to make sure that it is Alex. So I think merging that with business logic is a whole nother topic we could talk about for hours, but an interesting one as well, and possible in Rasa. So then, that's my favorite one. My team at Rasa doesn't like it anymore because I've been showing it over the last 3 years. But I hope there are some new people in the audience, so I hope you appreciate it. But it's Steve Ballmer on stage back then at Microsoft shouting, developers, developers, developers. And I think as much as this is true, right, so building level 3, building contextual assistants, you need developers. I also more and more think that they are only one small part of a team. As much as like, in the early days of the web, you had only developers shipping websites, right? And only developers developing websites. And as we know now, there are whole teams of people that work on this, right? You have a designer, you have UX designers, you have product managers. All of those different people that ship websites is something, and we just had a panel on that yesterday at Rasa Summit here, is something that we see more and more across organizations that ship the best conversational AI. And so, obviously from Silicon Valley known, a famous product team of like different people, right? They actually didn't have as many designers, but just as a quick example, you pretty much need a team. I think that's what it boils down to, right? And this team might have more developers than data scientists, or they have less, so that I think depends what you really want to ship. But in the end, it's not just a one-person show, and that's really also the big trend that we see in the market right now. And for level 2, it's a little different, right? Because if you think about it, all you need there is actually some UI where you match some intent to a response, right? So that's actually fairly easy to do, and you can almost, and there are lots of tools that do that, allow a business user who is like the domain expert to just come up with the responses, and this person can obviously also map it to the input. But then once you go beyond that and you want to integrate into your back-end systems and all of that, it's becoming really tricky, and that's really what we think conversational AI needs more and more. And so I was talking about like teams, right? But those teams also use different tools. And that's exactly what we talked about yesterday. And Vittorio is here, for example. I saw somebody else running around earlier. I can't find them anymore. But folks from those companies are also here today. And it is really like, in the end, if you think about it as like product management, the same for a website, right? You probably have a design in Sketch or wherever, whatever tool you use, then you user test it. After this user test, you probably talk to your engineers how you can implement it, and then you implement it. Then you get data from this implementation, and then you probably improve it, hopefully, if you're a product company. And so those iteration cycles is something that we see more and more happening, and something that I think the industry very much needs, right? The problem is, it is really hard, right? So it's just really, back to my point, it's like very early days. So it's not like in the web world nowadays, like a designer can go to an engineer and say, well, can you please implement this footer or this navigation bar on top, right? And everyone knows what they are talking about. And that's really something we talk more about this, I think, a big challenge in the space at the moment. That's really, like, one way to think about it in conversations is like, as I just said, like you have this like nav bar in a website. What is the equivalent to that in conversations? Well, it's different dialogue elements pretty much, right? So maybe somebody asks a question back and you want to call it like a reference question or something like that, right? Or somebody agrees to some question, and it might be another element. And what we're really interested in Rasa is like how you can use these elements also for the machine learning learning for the dialogue, right? Because again, that's kind of about pattern matching as well. If you know that in certain like states of the conversation, people always like divert, then this is something really interesting to learn from and improve over time. Yeah, we need advances in both applied research and tools, and I think that's also really what it's all about. So what's new in research? just a quick update on that. A lot is new in research. BERT and GPT-2 are still all over the place. I think every week there's something new, cool happening in NLP at the moment, which, as I said to my point earlier, is really also only just one part of the whole like conversational AI stack, if you will. GPT-2 obviously as well, so anything around like natural language generation is super exciting. From our experience, even further away in the future, just because in most companies you actually don't want a neural net to create your messaging, right? Because it's a bit risky at times, right? I mean, Tay from Microsoft, I think, is a really good example for that still. But it's happening and it's super exciting, and we are doing a lot of research also on that side, mostly on the NLU side right now. Then Glue is out, SuperGlue is in, so what does it even mean? So Glue has been around like in NLP research for quite some time, and it's pretty much like a way how you can measure how well your model performs across some certain standard tasks. And so because there's been so much advancements in the last couple of months, SuperGlue is now like a new challenge, kind of, if you will, for NLP systems to be understood, right? But NLP systems do a lot of other things. They do question answering, text extraction, and all of that. And so that's all part of that. And as you can see, like just the benchmarks are getting much better and better. And then also what's really interesting, I think, is like few-shot generalization across dialogue tasks. And that's kind of what I was alluding to earlier. How can you learn from a dialogue behavior if somebody interrupts your assistant? How can you not pre-program that again into the other next interruption, but this person can still handle it, right? And humans are pretty good at that. So if you teach somebody how to handle an angry customer who's calling into your call center, this person is probably really good at handling this person next time, right? And it's getting better over time, and that's really what we mean with that. So what does it mean from a developer view? Alan, my co-founder, wrote this blog post a couple of years ago that we don't know how to build conversational software, and it's kind of how we started with Rasa also. And what we've done over time is trying to solve this problem of like kind of do-it-yourself NLP for bot developers. So really like not using wit.ai anymore, but like plugging it into your own system, like doing your own NLU for level 2, right? Then, as I said earlier, we launched, that was kind of the first Rasa t-shirt here, by the way. Still very much in love. And then we launched this dialogue management, which pretty much solves this problem that I just talked about for conversational AI, building contextual assistants. That was like 2 years ago. We're still very much working on this. It's like in the 1.0 release now, so pretty mature, and we're really excited about it, but there's so much stuff that still has to be solved. But it's really algorithms won't solve all of that. And so that goes back to this like workflow and tool question that I brought up earlier. And I think we don't have enough time to go into this, but you know, this is kind of the way how training data looks. But it's super hard to manage. So what we've done is like build a UI on top of that that pretty much allows you to learn from real conversations. And like back to the point, really like throwing something out there as fast as possible. And then you can come to me afterwards if you want to see that demo. And so important to understand like what it's not and what it is, because a lot of tools in the market do UIs. It is definitely a tool to learn from real conversations, but it's not just a click and drag bot tool. That's not the target audience that we're working with. I think it's really hard to build level 3 with just a click and drag tool. And at some point in time we might have that, but this is not what Rasa X is, our new product. Transfer learning, I talked about this already. Really important for like what else is needed in level 3. We're really excited about end-to-end training as well. So pretty much dialogue, so not having NLU and dialogue management separate. And then really also the personalization aspect, as I said. Cool. I'm here the rest of the day. Come and find me. We are also hiring here in San Francisco, in Berlin as well, pretty much across the world. If you're interested in that topic, come talk to me. As a company, our goal is to build the standard infrastructure layer for conversational AI, so pretty much the same way as you use HTML, JavaScript, CSS to build web applications, we think something like that is needed to build AI assistants across all channels. If that's something that's interesting to you, come find me. There are some people from the Rasa team as well here, and tomorrow Ty from our team also gives a workshop, so if you're more curious about that, come join Thai. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. One quick question. One question. One question. 2, 3. We got 5 minutes, so we have to be really quick with it. All right. No questions? One question. There we go.
Thank you, Alex. Question for you. To reach the level 5 autonomous organization, does deep learning have a role in that? Just to echo some of Peter Voss's concerns.
So is your question if deep learning will bring us to level 5? Yeah, it's a really good question. I have to say I don't know. So level 5 for us is something that is just a way how we think about the topic. I think the world is still far away from level 5 overall, and we'll see if deep learning will bring us there. I think it's a probably 10 to 15 year project for the future, overall, level 5, and we don't know yet. I think there's some good chance, but we'll see. I think it's more about like the types of companies that will get there, and I think that's something, maybe just one sentence around that. What we do see is that there are more and more companies who see themselves as like ML first companies, or at least powered by ML companies, and that's definitely something that I think is really, really required, right?
All right, really quick. We have like 1 minute.
When it comes to training the model, how does the process work for you? Like, is it more manual, or is it you can look at utterances of real conversations and then drag and drop to these intents, or do you have to like use command lines? How does that work for you?
So what most of our users do is that they kind of come up initially with some form of like beta version of their assistant, and they, in the beginning, like the team, kind of, so the product team that I mentioned, comes up with like different utterances and like design, right, using something like Bot Society, for example, then plugging it into Rasa, and then there's usually a phase of like internal testing where they collect more training data and like improve the flow, and then what we recommend, and still most companies I think are a bit like cautious about this, is to put it out there in the wild as fast as possible. And I think the reason why a lot of companies are cautious is because they see then conversations fail, and that's totally fine, right? Because nobody ever compared an assistant to your FAQ page, right? So you don't know if you have the equivalent of an FAQ page on your website. Nobody talks about bounce rates on FAQ pages, right? People just assume, I mean, they work in that sense, but do they really solve your customer's problem? I would say most times not, right? That's why they then call in on your phone. And so I think a lot of companies are still afraid, and I wish not many, and I think it's more and more changing, also through the success stories that we see in the market, but it's still something where people are cautious about.
Okay, so you had mentioned a few different ways in which level 3 is hard. How do you see it as being easy? As in, what are the similarities amongst the different companies who have actually achieved it already that you see consistently?
So you mean what makes it easier to do it?
Yeah, so there's a few different examples of companies that have achieved level 3. What do you see as the similarities amongst those companies that consistently allow them to achieve that level while other companies haven't been able to do that yet?
Yeah, so I think the main similarity is that they have more than one person, and it's usually more like 5 to 15 people, and they have different roles. So there's a product designer, there's a UX designer or conversational designer, you have a product manager, you have developers, you have data scientists who then like improve the models over time, right? So that's definitely consistency that we see. And then those teams tend to usually work with something open source, and obviously have a bias on what they should be using. Rasa's open source framework, but it is, I think that's kind of boils down, I mean, the same way as like the most successful mobile applications are also not shipped by one developer, right? They are, I mean, Airbnb also is a great example of like tons of different product teams working on that. Yeah.
Let's give a round of applause for Alex. Thank you.